Watercolor is my very favorite. I love to see how the color flows through the water and how the end result shows how the colors of the water kind of came together. They blended, how fluid it is. I like how watercolor is not really harsh. It's kind of soft and light and airy. The end result is not always very precise. You don't always know what happens, but that's part of the fun. All right, the first step is a really basic step. It's just getting your wet paint onto the dry paper. You're going to take the pigment, put it on your palette, add a good bit of water, and then paint it onto the dry paper. This is really your first layer, your first step, an easy way to get a good bit of coverage. The first layer is going to be really light. As it dries, you can go back over it with more wet paint, and each subsequent layer is going to be a little darker and a little crisper. And a little thicker, but the first step is just getting the paint onto the paper. The next technique is called underpainting. It's a little bit of an advanced technique, but it's a way to add value to watercolor, which is really not always easy. And what this does, it really shows an understanding also of color theory. What you do is you take a basic color, like this orange, and then you go to its complementary color. It's the color across from it on the color wheel. In this case, the complementary color for orange is blue. I'm going to go over the orange with a little bit of blue to create kind of a darker value, almost a grayscale. Which is what happens when the complementary colors interact. You might have to kind of mix the colors a couple times to get that gray shade, that darker gray value, but it's a really good way to add shade when you need it. Now I've got a pumpkin that actually looks kind of like a pumpkin, where the darker spots and the shading is supposed to be. Making a tint means that you are adding elements of white to your original pigment. There are a couple ways to do this in watercolor. The first one is really that you just dilute the original pigment with water, and that's going to take out the pigment that's there and leave you with kind of elements of white. That's what I've done on the top. The other way is a little more old school, where you just mix the white and the original color, and that's going to give you a lighter version of the original shade. Another fun way to add interest to your watercolor is to get some wet pigment on the paper, and then you've got kind of a wet area, and then you take your brush, put it in a different color, and get that really wet, and then you go to the edge of the brush and you flick the bristles, and that's going to spray a little bit of paint onto the wet paint that's already on your paper, and it creates kind of a nice blending effect of the new color on top of the old color. Another way to add value to your watercolor pigment is to shade it, which means to add a little bit of black. Sorry, this is a little bit of a video fail, but if you look at how I'm mixing the color, you see I've got the original green and I'm adding a tiny, 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 tiny little bit of black, but that is going to darken the original green and make it a shade that you can use to add values and shadows. To show texture in a fluid medium like watercolor, use the dry brush technique. Take undiluted paint, put it on a dry brush, and put it on dry paper. At the top, I've done it on blank paper. At the bottom, I've put it on dried paint. One of the tricks of watercolor is to figure out how to get your whites to show up, because the paint follows the water, and water is generally all over the paper, you've got color all over the paper. And since white is really so light against the darker colors, it's difficult to show up. The trick is to create a barrier, a relief between the color and the water and the paper. And so with both cases, I'm using a wax crayon or a candle in creating that barrier. You've got to press down pretty hard, but you'll notice when you put the candle and the crayon on there and then cover it with wet paint that it keeps the water from going there and leaves the space white. Another fun way to get white on your watercolor is by using salt. The salt actually soaks up the pigment. So in this example, I've got some very wet watercolor on my paper. I add the salt and I sprinkle it on the paper and it soaks up the pigment. Once it is all dry, you just scrape off the salt and you've got a nice little white spot. That's kind of fun for doing winter trees or things like that. Sorry for the sideways video mashup here, but here is another cool way of getting white into your watercolor painting. You take some rubbing alcohol, you put it on the end of a Q-tip, and you put it onto wet watercolor paint, and it creates these super cool circles with really kind of crisp edges along the end of the circle. Fun technique. My favorite, lifting. I use this for clouds and other things, but you can always take the paint off the paper by blotting it with a little paper towel. Nothing is permanent in watercolor. Another way to add interest to your paintings is to get the wet paint on the end of the brush, flick the bristles, and it makes little dots on either white paper or dried up paint.